I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
You don't ever say to her that
what about the Chautauqua
Institute?
Introductory
discussion on the ethical
We left.
for a community.
Before China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
General Robert Kaler retired from the U.S. Air Force in January 2014 after more than 38 years of service. As the former commander of U.S. Strategic Command, he was directly responsible to the President and the Secretary of Defense. His distinguished military career began in the ROTC program at Penn State, where he earned his bachelor's degree in education. We'll talk with him about national security in the 21st century, about today's nuclear arsenal, and about cyberspace and outer space as potential areas of conflict. Here's our conversation with General Robert Kaler. General Robert Kaler, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
You've been called a scholar leader, which I find especially interesting because your passion was music, and you had envisioned yourself as becoming a music teacher, not one of the nation's top military leaders.
I actually auditioned to be an Air Force band officer, and much to their satisfaction and mine, I didn't pass the audition. So I wound up coming into the Air Force to go into intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the rest, as they say, is history. I found out that I was passionate about the Air Force, and as it turned out, I had tremendous opportunities over the years, and even though I thought that I was going to be in for 4 years and back teaching high school music somewhere, I found my real calling.
And you spent almost 39 years in the military.
Just under 39 years.
The last assignment was commander of STRATCOM, and you were directly responsible to the President and the Secretary of the Defense for the plans and the operations of all U.S. forces, also in protecting U.S. interests in cyberspace and outer space. That sounds like a huge, heavy responsibility. And while it's not yours right now, I'm wondering now, what today are the major concerns for the United States in that respect?
Well, I think the command in Omaha, Strategic Command today, began as Strategic Air Command, and its real focus during the Cold War was on nuclear deterrence. And that responsibility remains. In fact, that remains their top responsibility on a day-to-day basis, to make sure that they're deterring a nuclear attack against the United States and our key allies and our partners overseas. But there were a number of other things added to Strategic Command's portfolios over the years. Space was one of those. And of course, space, there are 3 words that we were using to describe the situation in space today. It's become more crowded and competitive and congested and contested. Actually, that's 4 words, but that's the general thrust of what we saw happening in space. It's very congested there these days, lots of debris. Very concerning. In fact, several years ago, there was an unintended collision between 2 satellites, an active satellite and a dead satellite that collided. And so knowing what's happening in space, where the objects are, they're traveling at tremendous speeds. And so understanding what we call situational awareness for space is a big concern of Strategic Command. It's also one of the places where we're concerned about future threats and whether or not in some future conflict those resources there, as important as they are, would be threatened.
Well, there are some who say that we need to, at all costs, prevent the weaponization of space, and I'm wondering how you feel about that.
Well, I think that weaponization and militarization are 2 different words. Let's talk about militarization for a second. Certainly, the United States uses space for national security purposes, has since the 1960s, really, and will continue to use space for national security purposes. Other countries do that as well. And in my view, I don't think there's anything wrong with using space for military purposes any more than we use the air, the sea, or the land for military purposes, for national security. Weaponizing space is a different question, and whether or not we put weapons in space is a policy issue, I think, to be debated as time passes. I never felt like there was a need to put weapons in space. I think that we'll have to let time pass and see whether there's a need, if that enhances our national security in the future. I think that there's an opportunity for our policymakers to have that debate.
In fact, President Obama says we need a code of conduct in space.
I supported a code of conduct when I was one of his combatant commanders. I think that it's about rules of the road. I think that understanding where objects are is very important. Understanding whose objects they are is very important. And I think, as we saw through either intended activities, the Chinese tested an anti-satellite weapon in low Earth orbit not so long ago, some years ago, and created a large debris field. Then we had this unintended collision. Their satellites are being moved periodically to avoid collisions. The International Space Station occasionally gets moved. Of course,
China, I think, launched a satellite that inadvertently ruined one of their weather satellites and caused a lot of the debris you're talking about.
And so, well, they did that on purpose. And so we see that as a big concern as time passes, and it's important, I think, to have a set of rules that everyone abides by. It's like ships passing on the high sea. There's a set of rules that dictate how that should happen, and so there are no collisions. It's like speed limits on highways, and some have argued that speed limits don't prevent speeders, and that's true, but speed limits tell you who they are. And
who the speeders are.
Absolutely, they tell you who the speeders are. And so I think that a set of prudent international code of conduct kinds of steps would be very important and very helpful. And I think there's a large part of the international community that thinks so as well.
Well, you talked about our nuclear weapons and the fact that we continue to need them. We need to keep them safe, secure, and effective. 90% of the world's nuclear weapons are in the hands of the United States and Russia, and non-proliferation treaties are between those two governments. There isn't a treaty with China. Do we need a treaty with other countries?
I think eventually we will. I think that when we look at the progress that's been made in reducing the threat from nuclear weapons between the Soviet Union and the United States, and now Russia and the United States, there's been tremendous progress. The arsenals of both countries have been reduced dramatically since the height of the Cold War.
But still way beyond the START treaty's numbers of 1,550 per country. I think we have nearly 5,000.
Well, the 1,550 is the number for operationally deployed. You're allowed to have more in your overall stockpile. We think there's a way to the future that will reduce the numbers in the overall stockpile, but we have to modernize the infrastructure that takes care of that stockpile. And when you modernize that infrastructure, you'll be able to reduce the numbers that we hold in reserve, if you will, in case we have problems in the operational force. The United States is still above the numbers that are allowed in the operational force, the 1,550, and is on a pathway to get down to that number. And so I think that was another prudent step. It's a verifiable way with the Russians to improve and enhance our security, and theirs as well. And so I think we've done pretty well. As we look to the future now, the question will be what's next, and at what point in time we're prepared to entertain further reductions or we include other countries, I think is a decision for the policymakers to make. Considering
the power of nuclear weapons, does it really make any difference whether Russia has 1,000 and we have 500? There are some who say that the same deterrence effect could be reached if each country had 300 to 1,000.
There are still those who believe that minimum deterrence can be served with a minimum number of weapons. And I believe that we have had a very successful formula with Russia over the years where we have reduced to rough equivalence with them. We don't have absolute parity. For example, on a day-to-day basis, I think when we get down to 1,550, there may be a day when we're at 1,499 or 97 or whatever, and they might be at 1,450 or whatever. I think, though, the idea, and certainly our view of the foundations of deterrence, are that there's a rough parity, both a numeric parity and a technical parity, that needs to go with these reductions in the numbers.
Well, speaking of that technical parity, Russia just launched two nuclear missiles from a submarine, the Bulava, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is supposed to be the most ambitious and expensive weapons project in Russia's history. How concerned are you about something like that?
Russia has been on a very aggressive pathway to modernize their strategic nuclear forces and some of what we would have called tactical or theater nuclear forces as well. The United States is still living off the benefits of what had been the Reagan defense buildup in the mid to late 1980s. And so the Russians have moved forward, the Chinese have moved forward to modernize their strategic arsenals. They see the value of having those weapons in terms of deterrence. The United States is now at the point where we have some significant decisions to make, both about doing life extensions on the weapons themselves and modernizing and upgrading the delivery platforms. These are tough choices in difficult budget environments, and we're to the point where we're going to have to make some decisions about the way forward here. And I believe that the country needs to invest to continue to have a strong deterrent within the confines of the New START treaty and within a broader context that would say that a modern infrastructure will allow us to reduce the numbers in the stockpile.
The Associated Press recently ran a series of articles about our nuclear weapons force, very critical series. I'm wondering how concerned you are about some of the things they said. One, there's lacks oversight, lacks training, morale problems, that sort of thing.
Well, I was concerned any time issues arose in the nuclear deterrent force. I was concerned about issues that arose anywhere in our forces, whether that was space or cyberspace or anywhere else, but in particular, because of the consequences of the nuclear deterrent and the destructive capabilities and capacities of those weapons. I was concerned any time issues arose. As a joint commander at Strategic Command, I didn't have responsibility for organizing, training, and equipping the forces. I was provided those primarily by the Air Force and the Navy. And so they were responsible to make sure that the forces were trained and well led and all of those things. But we shared the responsibility to make sure that that overall force was safe, secure, and effective. I will tell you that my observation of the problems was that they were not representative of all the individuals that are dedicated and that come to work every day and are at the top of their game every day. But anytime anything happens, whether it's low morale or those issues that need to be addressed, they need to be addressed. And there have been a series of reviews and studies that have recently been done, gone to the Secretary of Defense. Secretary Hagel has commented here recently that he intends to act on all of those. The Secretary of the Air Force just yesterday commented that it doesn't matter if Secretary Hagel is still there or not.
Because he has, on November 24th, has said he's stepping down.
But she intends to continue to execute the recommendations that were laid out for him. I think they're all good recommendations. I think that the nuclear deterrent force suffered from the end of the Cold War. I think that there was inertia that carried it forward. There was investment that had been made that carried it forward. We became interested and involved in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places where young Americans were engaged in active combat. And so it's time for us once again to focus on the nuclear deterrent and to pay the attention to it that it deserves.
There are many who say, though, as long as we focus on the nuclear deterrent, other countries that had originally agreed not to pursue nuclear power, nuclear weapons, will. There's no reason for them not to.
I think just the opposite. In fact, I will tell you that our ability to extend our deterrent umbrella to our allies and our partners and make that a credible extension of our deterrence, I think, is preventing many of them from acquiring or wanting to acquire their own weapons. I think a number of our allies over the years would have made different decisions, perhaps, had our deterrent not been strong. And I don't for a minute buy that Kim Jong-un, for example, pursued nuclear weapons, or his father pursued nuclear weapons because the United States has them. I think that these weapons exist in the world. You can't put this genie back in the bottle. Perhaps someday some other weapon will take their place, but for now they're foundational to our security.
You mentioned Kim Jong-un, and I don't know if you're aware of a Sony Pictures movie that's called The Interview. It's a comedy about two journalists who are approached by the CIA with the assignment of assassinating Kim Jong-un. There are a number of people who believe that in retaliation for mocking that despot, there has been a hacking of Sony Pictures' vaults, and films that had not yet been released have been pirated and released. And others who think that movies like that are provocations that could ignite something much bigger. How concerned are you about things like that?
Well, the third major responsibility I started to talk about earlier for Stratcom was cyberspace. And Stratcom got that responsibility because of the major concern almost 10 years ago, actually, because of the growing concern that cyberspace would be an avenue for malicious actions against us in some way or another, either cyber vandalism or cyber crime or cyber espionage or cyber attack that would come against us, just like a nuclear attack would come, or a cruise missile attack, or some other kind of an attack. And so Stratcom was charged with trying to become the Department of Defense's response to the threats that would emerge through cyberspace. Those are real threats, and we have
significant... And do we have a handle on it?
Well, we have significant vulnerabilities, and the internet and our networks were never designed to be protected against the kinds of threats that are now emerging. They were designed to be open and free and easy to use, and all of those things that make them so appealing to all of us every day also make them, give them some inherent vulnerabilities. Also, our networks never grew up as one big, integrated, well-planned, well-thought-out network. They were designed as a group of different desktop systems that were put on our desks over the years. So there's a lot of work to do here. There are real vulnerabilities that exist, and we're going to have to do more to address them. By the way, it's not just a Department of Defense problem. This is an interagency problem. It's a law enforcement problem, it's a commercial problem, it's a civil problem, it's a power grid problem. All of us share in this responsibility.
Yeah, in fact, there seems to be some evidence that Illinois' water system was hacked, at least it was traced to a Russian server.
Well, I think all of these incidents that arise need to be investigated and pursued. It's easy to be ambiguous in cyberspace. It's easy to appear like someone else in cyberspace. It's also the determined actors in cyberspace who have the resources to be at the high end of sophistication here. Governments that really have the sophistication and the resources to be sophisticated. What's disturbing is if they're really good at it, you don't know they're there.
Well, this brings me to something that Lieutenant General Kowalski, who was commander of U.S. Air Force Global Strike, said. Our greatest risk is an accident or a stupid mistake when it comes to our nuclear forces. Not that long ago, 1995, Norway launched a missile to look at the Aurora Borealis. And the Russians thought that this was an attack of some kind and were within minutes of retaliation, but stood down.
Well, these kinds of issues that are high consequence, I think, are very low probability. So having said that, though, I can't speak for the Russians, although I do know this about the Russians. They have a very strict command and control system that surrounds their nuclear weapons just like we do. It's different in some respects, but its concept is the same, and that is that it gives the political leaders ultimate control of those weapons. Our nuclear weapons are under what we call the positive control of the President of the United States. And I never worried about whether or not we would have some kind of an accident or incident that caused our weapons to be launched. I think that we spend an unbelievable amount of time putting safeguards on top of safeguards to make sure that those kinds of things don't happen. And in terms of warning, assessing whether a threat is a nuclear threat, one of the positive developments, I think, since the end of the Cold War, which 95 was about the time that the Cold War ended, was I think that this sense of time urgency in making those decisions has changed some. Because I think that although the possibility of a massive attack over the poles from Russia, for example, still there. The capability still exists. The likelihood of that, I think we all believe, was very, very low. Still had to be deterred, but the likelihood is very, very low. Therefore, I think when you look at the possibility of nuclear weapon use today, not in 1995, not in 1975, not even in 2000, but in 2014, soon to be 2015, I think that there's a sense that this sense of urgency that might have gone with this at the height of the Cold War isn't there. I think that people have found ways to buy more decision time as well. And ultimately, human beings are in charge of these systems. They don't do things by themselves.
And can they be
human beings
hacked?
are in charge. Well, we've worked very hard to make sure that they can't. Now, you don't know what you don't know. And I think that I was highly confident that our nuclear systems, many of them, because they're old, were not in the position where they were connected to things that could have been hacked. And so I guess as a prudent military person, I would never be satisfied with that answer. I would never say to myself...
Because there's something like 450 warheads that could be launched from Wyoming or North Dakota or Montana.
Right. As long as we have these systems out there and they're deployed, then my view was you have to assume that some kind of hacking is possible, therefore you have to work hard to prevent it. And I never saw any evidence that there was hacking, nor did I see any evidence that there was an avenue for hacking, but I never walked away from that conversation believing that our work was finished. So I couldn't ever slap the table and say, nothing is perfect here. I could say, nothing is perfect, we better stay after this.
How concerned are you about the 3 national laboratories that support the work that Stratcom did? I'm talking about Los Alamos and Sandia and Lawrence Livermore. These are the facilities that provide the manpower, the expertise, in a world where, for instance, in the United States, the nuclear industry is not that vibrant, where those who had real expertise in nuclear power and nuclear weapons are retiring, and the facilities themselves are apparently in decline.
Very concerned about that. The industrial base that supports our nuclear weapons program, as well as propulsion for Navy submarines, and aircraft carriers. Our nuclear enterprise in the Department of Defense and Energy really has 2 big components to it. One is the nuclear deterrence part, the weapons. The other is nuclear propulsion. And so I was very concerned about the enterprise, the industrial enterprise that supports and sustains both of those. It's highly specialized. It's very technically oriented with a set of technical skills that really aren't needed in many other places. And so the infrastructure is aging. The people involved in the business are aging themselves. And so I think whether you believe from a policy standpoint that nuclear weapons are necessary, or whether you believe that we ought to get rid of all of them, you need this infrastructure in either case to take care of the stockpile. So,
how big is the stockpile today?
Well, you mentioned earlier it's around 5,000 weapons.
Here in the United States?
Here in the States. And the Russians say they have about the same number. We don't have an accurate count, I think, on all of the Russian weapons. It's something like that, something on the order of that.
Even decommissioning them has lots of people worried, especially in places like Russia, where it's believed that it hasn't been done very methodically, very safely. And there's this fear of rogue, non-governmental actors getting a hold of some of this and not launching a nuclear bomb, but a dirty bomb.
Some years ago, then Senators Nunn and Lugar put their heads together and they came up with a program called the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. It was a way at the end of the Cold War for the United States to invest some money in Russia in securing nuclear materials and in helping them secure weapons if that was necessary, etc. That program, I think, was spectacularly successful. About a year ago, maybe a little more, the Russians elected to not renew that program. So I think that much progress had been made in helping the Russians. I can't tell you today, because I don't have insight today into whether or not we think that risk still exists. I can tell you that in the United States, we spend an awful lot of time and energy and money in making sure that our weapons and materials are secure.
What keeps you up at night these days? You're not this. The responsibility you had is now on Admiral Haney's shoulders, but
right. A great American, by the way. He's the right guy. Well, I joked. I was asked this question at lunch, and I said 2 cats keep me awake at night now, which they do. No, I have never been troubled by things that were in the hands of our young men and women in uniform. I believe that once we put things in their hands, I relax, because at that point, I think that they're magnificent and they do wonderful things. I was always concerned and remain concerned about the things we haven't thought about. What aren't we planning for? What haven't we thought about? Where have we missed something along the way that can prove to be decisive? That always concerns me, and I think if there's anything that keeps me awake at night now, it's that.
General Kaler, thank you so much for talking with us.
You're quite welcome.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with General Robert Kaler. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also find additional video from this interview. I'm Patty Satalia. We hope you'll join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.